Sci-Fi Skirmish Scenarios by John Lambshead. Small unit missions for use with your favorite wargaming rules. This comes to us by way of Pen and Sword Books. I think it's pen-and-sword-co.uk. Costs about $23 American, UK $12.99. I expected this to come in January. It's now early December. It came early. How about that? And I want to do a little review of this and help you decide whether or not this would be right for you. Obviously, if you're a sci-fi skirmish wargamer, it's probably going to be for you. But even if you're not, it may still be for you. Stay tuned. We'll get to that. The way we're going to run through this review is to kind of look at the structure of the book first, and then we're going to circle back around and we're going to talk about each individual section in greater detail. And there's a lot of like looping back because there's a lot of stuff that all kind of builds on itself in this book. So if we just kind of open her up and take a look at the contents here, we'll lower down the gain there, and it's so we got a background, which is very nice, your very own dystopian world. So the first section is, and then you've got scenarios, you've got some solo scenarios and some campaign advice. And by and large, what's going to happen is, you know, the introduction is interesting. The scenarios are the meat of the matter. And I think the solo scenarios are pretty good. The scenarios campaign, kind of iffy on that one. And I do have some complaints about the structure of each of these, but we'll get to that in a moment. Like I said, the first thing I want to talk about is the fact that we start out with a forward, Rick Priestley. He's kind of that second generation of grand old men of the hobby. Kind of picked up the baton from the Don Featherstones, you know, and that kind of crew, and ran with it late 70s, early 80s, you know, and he's still working, right? So you can't do any better than that. So if he's endorsing this book, you know, I don't even need to, because he does. Now, the next thing we're going to do after we lock in our focus there is we're going to talk about the introduction, and this is interesting. There are a lot of like really interesting little tidbits in John's case for why you should be playing skirmish wargaming. Some of the little throwaway lines he has in here are worth entire books in their own right. We'll probably talk more about those observations in another video. Not really appropriate here, but very insightful, very interesting, and kind of makes the case for why you should, you know, expand your horizons when it comes to scenarios. Then we move into a background. This is going to be the default background that he uses as he presents his 36 scenarios. While we're here, I'll just point out that we've got some lovely color plates artwork here. And I mentioned this in my, you know, I left a little nugget in my shorts about the, okay, that came out wrong. I made a YouTube short in which I mentioned that I didn't see any 15 millimeter figures in here, which is kind of hurtful. I mean, you know, this is my jam, bro. And I feel a little bit left out. I feel a little, you know, emotionally, I feel a little hurt, but I'll power through it. So we got our 36 scenarios, and they're pretty good. And for each of these 36 scenarios, he says, I'm going to show you guys how to build your own. In the far-flung future, there's only conflict. And he walks you through how you might do that. And he sets up, now there's two things that he sets up here, factions and terrain. And those are going to come in really big when we get to the scenarios. The first thing he talks about is terrain. And you've got basically, the scenario is kind of a mashup of Necromunda and like a cyberpunk corporate dystopia kind of thing. So you've got your standard gangs and mercenaries and corporate security. You've got mutants crawling out of the wasteland. You've got cultists, religious zealots, and all, you know, miners, private, what would you call it? Like wildcats, I guess you could call it, independent producers in this kind of industrial, well, part of it's industrial. You've got your green zone, which is where your elites live. You've got condos, which is where guys like me live. Your factory zones, barrens. This is your wastelands, kind of outside of town, and then ruins. And that gives you a good mix. Badlands. Oh, I guess, you know, I'm not sure. Badlands is like the irradiated wastelands, and barrens is just kind of, you know, empty industrial zones, kind of on that border between industrial zones and ruins. So those are the settings, the terrain that you're going to experience as you go through these scenarios. And then he's got, like I said, corporate security. He's got, you know, militias, organized crime, right? So scavy tribes, we know where that comes from. So I'm not going to belabor the point. But the point is, he says, look, here's just kind of your standard. This is what he's going to use for the scenarios. So then we launch into the scenarios, and here I want to show you a neat little trick that he provides. Remember, I said there's 36 scenarios. We're going to use not percentile dice, but per hextile dice. I think that's what you call it when they're D6s. The green is tens place, and I score a 61. So I'm just going to show you one of these at random, and we're going to go through this exercise twice. This first one, 61, I'm going to show you the outline and how he presents the information, and then we're going to roll the dice again. We're going to look at a second one of these scenarios, and we're going to really tear it apart and look at what makes it tick. All right, so first of all, 61, let's turn to page, this is Mud, Glorious Mud, 102. Oh, I'm glad that we rolled this one because this one has some fun, almost, what would you call it? Joe McCullough-esque terrain stuff going on in it. And it starts out with an introduction. And here's where I have to offer a little bit of a warning, kind of maybe a little bit of a complaint, because the introduction sets up the fight. And in this case, it's spring melt has flash flooded, and you've got street gangs, and this roils the local militia who vow. So he's already set up it's street gangs versus militia. Now, on the one hand, this is just an example of how you might skin the neutral generic scenario that's presented here. Objectives. And we should always, I guess we'll start with the map, right? So he says, look, throw down a bunch of terrain items that are the islands that are safe with walkways between them. And as you can see, this is a mirror image on each side. So it's a pretty fair fight. And everything in between is mud. And he tells you, right, so then he tells you, the terrain, this is set in the Barrens, but I guess an industrial zone could happen. And then he says the forces, we've got a red force, which is the militia, and a blue force, which is the street gang. And then we have a game length, which is played for GL turns. Now, I want to pause here and talk about GL. Remember that this is a generic for use with your favorite wargame rules. Well, your favorite wargame rules, and I'm just going to use, as an example, Fistful of Lead. Fistful of Lead, in most of the games, you will play 6 turns. And then at the start of the 6th turn and every turn thereafter, you roll a d10. And if you roll the turn number or less, this is the last turn. That gives you an average game length of about 8 turns. Now, when John Lambshead says GL turns, if we're playing Fistful of Lead, okay, great. The game length is going to be 8 turns. But there may be some scenarios where there's a bit of a ticking clock, where there's a random game length. And what he will offer is on game length -1. Okay, well, for Fistful of Lead, I'm going to say average is 8 turns. Okay, so on turn 7, there's a chance that this is the last turn. On turn 8, there's a greater chance that turn 8 is the last turn. And then on turn 9, there's an even greater chance. And if by some miracle you play to turn 10, that's the last one, which gives you a good solid spread. And it allows you to use this for other games. Now, those of you guys that are playing one-page rules, and what's the science fiction one? Is it Grimdark Futures? If you're going to play Grimdark Futures with this, I gotta profess, I'm operating a little outside my comfort zone here. My one-page rules is limited to regiments, which has a 4-turn length. I believe it's going to be the same thing for the science fiction game. If that's the case, you may want to set your game length at 5 turns, because I know from experience that 4 turns is just enough to get stuff done in the one-page rules that I play. So you may need to bump that. You may need to adjust that average game length up by 1 or 2, or maybe down by 1 or 2. I might make this even longer if I'm playing Xenos Rampant, using these scenarios with Xenos Rampant. I may decide, well, normally Xenos Rampant is they've got a funky standard. I may just say 10, right? Because it's so wild and swingy with the activation. But that's one thing. So this is good, right? Because it's nice and generic. Hey, it's the game length, the average game length. Good. And then he gives you the winning. So at the end of each turn, you get 1 victory point for each island that they occupy. And then he gives you some additional special rules. And in this case, anytime one of your figures is moving off of the islands through the mud, you roll a d6 to see what happens. He may be removed from the game. He may move normally. He may move at half speed. He may have to stop. And then laying on the terrain fairly is critical for a decent game. Yeah, so he mentions a little bit of advice on that. Now here's where I have to offer up my little complaint that I warned you about earlier. To understand what's really going on, this one is fairly straightforward, but in a lot of cases, these scenarios, the information that you really need is in this section here to get started. The introduction includes some of the objectives and some of the background that informs what's in the rest of this. So it's not truly a generic setting or generic scenario, because you already have to go back to these you're already like, when you're presented with the setting first, it kind of sets the expectation. And it kind of limits where, okay, this is what it's going to be. Now I have to start changing things. So there's an additional little hurdle. Whereas if you started with all of the generic stuff, let's take a look at how Neil Thomas does it. He's got 30 scenarios in his book, and he presents the generic situation, red versus blue. And then down here he says, here's the inspiration. I prefer this organizational structure because your mind, as you read through the generic, you've got all of these different possibilities and your imagination really starts pumping, and it could be anything at all. And then you get down to this point, and then he says, hey, this is where it comes from. Here's some additional reading on some examples of that. Now, that may not really apply in the case of science fiction, but here is the application. I like this setup a lot better because it just removes one more hurdle to your imagination, particularly if you're going to use this book not just for sci-fi skirmish scenarios, but you could reasonably use a lot of these scenarios in something like modern combat, World War II, even fantasy, by just kind of reskinning it. But having to like scrape the skin off and then patch together something, that's just one additional hurdle between you, the book, and actually playing the game. So kind of a minor nitpick, I guess, because, I mean, we're all smart enough to figure out how to balance these things, but take it for what it is. If that's the worst thing I have to say about this book, then, man, Lambshead, you are doing okay. Now I've showed you what the overall structure is. Let's take a look at a second scenario, and we're going to roll and come up with 45. Before we dive into scenario 4-5, bioweapon, I just want to mention, and I think we all know this already, that when you throw down a table of miniature war games, there's really only about 4 scenarios that you've got. Can I get my dudes across the table? Can my dudes kill your dudes? Can I squat on real estate that we both want? And can I run around like meeting objectives, scoring points, completing a task before you can do the same? There may be like 1 or 2 other, but most of the scenarios that we play within the realm of miniature wargaming fit one of those 4 scenarios, right? So one of the things we're going to look at here is whether or not bioweapon meets one of those, or if it breaks out of that 4-game mold. And this, by the way, is not a complaint, right? Let's suppose there's 6 general scenarios. You've got 6 variations on those scenarios. And I should point out, right here we've got a blue setup zone and red on either side. Because if you take those 6 scenarios and you have 6 different setups like this, we'll take a look at another one real quick. Okay, red and blue, this is your fairly bog standard, line them up and run at each other. But you may even have something like, there's some really interesting ones in here where, well, that's not one. A smarter guy than me probably would have done this beforehand. Well, let's take a look at bioweapon. Here's our, so blue sets up over here in this corner, and red sets up anywhere along here. And not only that, but red has 2 gates that red can take to get out of their scenario zone. So let's just look through it. We've got a bioweapon, and it looks like we've got private security versus some kind of religious cult. Okay, great. There's a bomb in the middle of the playing area, and that's what the map shows here. It says bomb. The forces, the cultists set up in the blue zone, so you've got a cult here, and this is what I'm talking about. It's not force blue, it's not force red. It's cultists trying to set us up the bomb, and our private security coming out of their compound, apparently. But this is where, again, we get into the point that I'm not sure exactly what the setup is until I go back through the introduction. And I'm not interested in doing that on the fly. Instead, the game continues until the bomb explodes or disarmed. The cultists must protect the bomb until the timer triggers. So there's suicide cultists. Okay. Death cultists. We know all about those, don't we? Every world's got them, including ours. While the proctors must take control and disarm the bomb by cutting the right wire. The bomb explodes, the cultists win, otherwise the proctors win. Additional special rules. At the end of each turn, the cultist player rolls a die, keeping a running total. The bomb explodes when the bomb explosion count total exceeds 20. I'm assuming it's a D6. What? Total exceeds 20. Man, a D6 has an average of 3.5, so you're looking at 5 turns 5 or 6 turns, that's all you get. You might need to adjust that based on the game length, based on the rules that you're using. 5 turns might be too many. 5 turns might be way too long. The proctors take command of the bond by having a model adjacent to it, and then they roll a d6. On a 2, 3, or 4, they cut the wrong wire, nothing happens. On a 5 or 6, the player cuts the right wire, and on a 1, the wrong wire has been cut, and roll a d6 and add that to the bomb explosion counter. So even if you get your forces there, right? So it's pretty random scenario. But look, this is one of our scenarios where you've got a point in the middle that both sides are trying to protect. One side's trying to get to it, the other is trying to prevent them from getting to it. And it's kind of a nice blend of a couple of those scenarios, and that's what I'm talking about. Now we can use this as an example of, hey, Mr. Wargaming, I'm a fantasy wargamer. Is this a good book for me? Well, yeah, because this timer could be anything. It could be a cage in the center of your fantasy town that the dangerous beast is threatening to escape from, and the proctors have to get there and lock it before. Well, actually, it would be the death cult is trying to let it go in this case, and the proctor's trying to protect it, right? So you could reskin it very easily. Could you reskin this as a World War II game? I don't know. Could it be that this is like a radio tower? I'm not a World War II gamer. You figure it out. Probably, you're smart guys. You guys figure it out. But that kind of gives you an idea of some of the freshness of this game. Now, the other question becomes, hey, well, it says Skirmish on this, but hey, tap your forehead. I like to think outside the box. What if I wanted to play a game like the latest craze, Xenos Rampant? Could I play this scenario with warbands? Yeah, I don't see why not. I'm still curious about, here we go. Yeah, the perimeter wall can only be crossed through one of the gates. Through one of the gates? Oh, so you got to pick which one, huh? Can only be crossed. This is the only way the proctors come out. So really your deployment zone is going to be something like that. That's kind of interesting. Could you play with warbands? Yeah, I don't see why not. I mean, you just have more figures on the table. And then I should also point out that this terrain, it looks open here, but that's because he tells us it's set in the green zone, which is kind of sorry about the bump there. The green zone is kind of the swanky posh. I mean, we're all aware of what the green zone was in Baghdad. It's that, but, in sci-fi land. So there you go. That gives you 2 examples of the 36 scenarios. If that's not enough of a taste to get you to pay for the rest, then there's no helping you. Or maybe you already know and you're done, so you're going to punch out. But before you do, for those of you that are still interested, let's take a look at the random scenario generator. All right, so but this random scenario, like I showed you how you generate your random scenarios, this one is just, we'll roll 2d6 to find out what the forces are. Roll 2d6 to find out how many turns there are. Roll to determine what your setup is. Roll d6 here. You might have something funky like red sets up in 2 corners, blue sets up kind of in the center, right? And kind of staggered, red, blue. Well, that's kind of interesting. And what the objective is depends on that. Types of. So again, random tables are your friend. Unpredictable. Bashing them together in wild ways. This may be just as useful for you as the rest of the book. But I don't want to talk about the scenario games. There's a couple of scenarios here, and one of them, this flank guard, is that the one? Yeah, is really like Space Invaders. See, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 zombies or robots or whatever. There's a mob that's moving this way, and you as the player have to stop them. There's a lovely little AI that tells you whether each of the individuals that shows up. So again, you roll a d6 to find out where they come from, and maybe you roll 2d6. Hey, we got 2 guys coming from 4. Well, then you roll a d6 to find out how they move, and they may move directly towards your boys. They may move at a 45-degree angle. They may actually not move. Maybe they move back once, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Nice little AI system, nothing too innovative or different from what you've seen before, but it's really nice to have somebody sit down, spell it all out for you so that you don't have to do anything. You can save your thinking for the tactics, not for the, what did I decide they'd move? What did I decide the one would mean? Well, it's right it's right here in the chart. Oh, on a 3, the enemy model moves down the table straight towards the player's table edge. One less thing to remember, one more chart to check means that you can spend more brain power thinking about, well, do I want to put my heavy gun on the right, in the center, on the left? You get what I'm saying here. He does the lifting for you. And even if it's not particularly innovative, there's some value here. In addition, and this is on top, this is kind of frosting on top of the scenario cake. From scenarios to campaigns, this is kind of the last section. And I think this is probably the weakest section because he talks about, oh, are you going to do a narrative campaign? Oh, I'm just playing 2 scenarios and then I'm just making up the connective tissue post facto. Yeah, but this kind of section, you have to include it. We all know what the different campaigns are. Oh, you could play, if you lose a battle, you get 1 point. And if you win a battle, you get 3 points. And if you win a battle, you get to pick whether you're the attacker or the defender on the next battle, right? These are all things that we've seen dozens of times before. But I really do think you need to include a section like this to tie a neat little ribbon and bow on this book. It has an introduction, it has the meat, and then it has a little bit of a side salad in the solo gaming, and then this is kind of the dessert to kind of tie it all together. Yeah. And then we also have campaign. So he gives you a couple of examples of scenarios, right? Battle 1, just play battle 1, 2, 3 all the way through, and then it tells you kind of the if-then statements. So this is a bit like a branching campaign, if you will. And then we've got corporate rivalry. And again, this is corporate rivalry. Here's a campaign world for you. It's very similar to, and once again, I like to compare and contrast. For those of you that have seen Xenos Rampant, this material in the back where our friends Dan Mercy and Richard Cowan, I mean, I don't know if we're friends. I like them. I hope they like me too. They give you this example of detachment lists for Xenos. What is this? Which setting is this? All right, space opera, right? So if you're going to do space opera, and then he gives you various. This is a whole campaign that you can play with the various forces. So this is kind of that for your generic. And then the Cult of the Promised Utopia. Again, cultists versus cops. Which, there you go. There's your red hats and your cops, your glowies and your normal Americans. And then appendix, model manufacturers. And I like this too, just to, again, little bit of dessert here for you. And what's really nice is he breaks it out by 25, 28 millimeters, and he lists a whole bunch of manufacturers, most of which Reaper, Rogue Stars, North Star figures. We got Heresy miniatures in here. He does mention, Lead Adventure? .de. So those are the guys. Mantic Games. And then, what is this? Look. Oh, let's get the light there. 15 millimeter. All right, we're off our break, John Lambshead. We're best friends again. Alternative Armies Brigade. And I like this because there's actually a couple in here that I didn't know about. What is this? RPE Miniatures. Oh, Ralph Arthur Europe. Yeah, I know about those guys. But who was the one? Ramshackle Games. I didn't realize that they had 15 millimeter. And there's another. Vanguard was new to me, so I really appreciate him kind of pointing those out. And then he goes through with MDF terrain and just kind of generic rules. Black Ops by Guy Bowers. Gamma Wolves by Ash Barker. Sup? He doesn't watch my show. Gaslands by Mike Hutchinson. Again, Mike Hutchinson, I gotta throw, for those of you guys that like to get into the guts of games, you gotta look up Mike. He's on the Use Tubes every week. Every Friday, they do a deep dive on Rule of Carnage. Just look up Rule of Carnage, or maybe I'll forget to put a link in the description like I do. And then, more Ash Barker. Look, he recommends, this is kind of a boss move, 1 Hour Skirmish War Games by John Lambshead. Yeah, I've got that. It's a good book. And again, it's by penandswordbooks.com. Wait a minute. penandswordbooks.com. Rogue Stars. We played that here on the channel. penandswordbooks.com. Forgive me. I feel like I'm going crazy here. Is this? Yeah, there. Look. Pen and Sword. I was right. pen-and-sword.co.uk. And then penandswordbooks.com. So either one of those. Look at it. You got, when it comes to the website, you've got options, which is on brand, because when it comes to this book, you've got 36 options plus, however many permutations you have here in your random scenario generator. I think it's a fine book. John Lambshead's writing is easy breezy. It's the typical, look, it's the same size, right? I don't know if this is probably Pen and Sword books too. Yeah, Pen and Sword Military, right? Same size. So they're going to look really good on your shelf. It's the same size as Lambshead's other book, which we reviewed on the channel, the 1 Hour Skirmish War Games, which I'll forget to put a link in the description. And, if that really bothers you, you could look it up, and there's comments down there that you can tell me whether you think this review helped you or not. Or you could not. You're a big boy. I'll be okay. I'll survive. So there you go. Sci-Fi Skirmish Scenarios. Hope this helped. Till next time, I'm praying for you.